The will hit Harrison's desk like a death sentence. Marry within 30 days or lose $3 billion and everything he'd built. He had 1 month to find a wife, and only one woman had ever made his heart race and his carefully constructed control crumble. Sophie Winters would never agree to marry him willingly, which meant he'd have to destroy her world until she had no choice. The whiskey glass shattered against the marble fireplace, amber liquid streaming down the wall like bitter tears. Harrison Cross stood in his grandfather's study, the will still trembling in his hands, and felt his carefully constructed world tilt on its axis. Married. For 1 full year. Or lose everything. He had 30 days. The old man had orchestrated this from beyond the grave. A final manipulation from the only person Harrison had ever truly respected. $3 billion and the CEO position of Crosstech Industries hung in the balance. If he failed, his cousin Marcus would inherit everything, and Marcus would gut the company Harrison had spent a decade building, selling it off piece by piece to the highest bidders. Harrison's mind raced through possibilities with the cold calculation that had made him a billionaire by 32. A business arrangement, a contract, someone desperate enough to agree to his terms, someone he could control. And then her face materialized in his thoughts, as it had with increasing frequency over the past 3 years. Unbidden, unwelcome, undeniable. Sophie Winters, the thorn in his side. The woman who'd stood in the lobby of his building 6 months ago, fire in those gray-green eyes, her voice shaking with barely contained fury as she accused him of destroying her latest project. He'd been buying a property for a new luxury development. She'd been trying to turn it into a homeless shelter. He'd won, as he always did. But he remembered the way her cheeks had flushed with anger. The way she'd stood her ground despite being half a foot shorter than him. The way she'd looked at him like he was something she'd scraped off her shoe. And he remembered the strange heat that had coiled in his chest, the way his pulse had quickened, the way he'd found himself thinking about her for days afterward. He'd told himself it was irritation. It had to be irritation. Now, staring at the impossible requirement in his grandfather's will, Harrison felt something shift inside him, a door opening that he'd kept locked for years. Sophie was perfect. Idealistic enough to care about her causes, desperate enough to need his money, principled enough to despise him. She'd never agree to a fake marriage willingly, which meant he'd have to give her no choice. The plan crystallized with ruthless clarity. Harrison pulled out his phone, his fingers, moving with steady purpose even as something uncomfortable twisted in his gut. He pushed the feeling aside. He'd learned long ago that sentiment was a liability in business, and this was just another transaction. Even if the thought of seeing Sophie again made his throat go dry. 3 days later, Sophie received the eviction. Notice for the Mercy Street building, the headquarters of Horizon's house, the nonprofit she'd poured 5 years of her life into building. The letter was coldly professional, giving her organization 60 days to vacate the premises. The building had been sold to Cross Development Holdings. Of course it had. Sophie crumpled the paper in her fist, rage and desperation warring in her chest. Harrison Cross had finally found a way to destroy her completely. This wasn't just another property dispute. This was her life's work, the safe harbor for hundreds of people who had nowhere else to turn. The phone call came that evening. Harrison's assistant, polite and impersonal, requesting a meeting the following morning. Sophie almost refused, but something in her core, some instinct for survival, told her she needed to hear what he had to say. Maybe she could negotiate, find some angle he hadn't considered. She spent the night rehearsing arguments, building her case, trying to ignore the way her hands trembled. When Sophie walked into Harrison's office the next morning, she was prepared for his arrogance, his cold dismissal, his casual cruelty. What she wasn't prepared for was the way he looked at her. Like she was a puzzle he was trying to solve. Like she was something more than just an obstacle to remove. Harrison had told himself he was ready. He'd prepared his arguments with the same strategic precision he brought to hostile takeovers. But when Sophie walked through his door, wearing that threadbare blazer she'd owned for years, and carrying herself like a queen despite the circles under her eyes, something in his chest constricted painfully. She was exhausted. He'd done that to her. The realization should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like he'd swallowed glass. Sophie stopped 3 feet from his desk, refusing to sit when he gestured to the chair. She stood there, spine straight, chin lifted, and Harrison found himself studying the small details he'd cataloged over the years, without realizing it. The way she twisted her watch band when she was anxious, the faint scar above her left eyebrow, the way her hair fell forward when she was angry, and she'd impatiently tuck it behind her ear. He was staring. He forced his gaze back to her eyes. Sophie spoke first, her voice steady despite the fury simmering beneath. She told him he could have the building. He could have everything else too, but she had 300 people depending on Horizon's house, and she wasn't going to let them down without a fight. Harrison leaned back in his chair, forcing himself to appear relaxed even as his heart hammered against his ribs. He told her he wasn't interested in negotiation. Then he laid out his offer. Marriage. 1 year. In exchange, he'd provide unlimited funding for Horizon's house for the next decade, plus 3 additional properties for expansion. He'd already had the contracts drawn up. Sophie stared at him like he'd lost his mind. Then she laughed, a short, bitter sound that made Harrison's jaw tighten. She told him no. Obviously no. What kind of person did he think she was? Harrison expected that response. He'd prepared for it. So he told her about the rest of it. The quiet conversations he'd had with her board members, the documents he'd obtained showing minor financial irregularities that could be made to look much worse. He told her about her biggest donor, who'd pulled funding yesterday after a phone call from someone at Crosstech. He told her about the other properties in the city that she'd been considering for expansion, which he'd just purchased. He'd backed her into a corner with nowhere to turn, and he delivered each blow with calm precision, while something sick churned in his stomach. Sophie's face had gone pale, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Harrison could see her mind working, see the exact moment she realized she was trapped. She asked him why. Why her? Why this? Why couldn't he just find someone who actually wanted to marry him? The question hit harder than it should have. Harrison stood, moving around his desk before he could stop himself, drawn by some magnetic pull he didn't understand. He told her she was perfect for his purposes, above reproach, morally upright, completely believable as someone who could reform a ruthless billionaire. The inheritance requirement demanded a legitimate marriage, something that would pass scrutiny. She was his best option. He didn't tell her the rest, that she was the only woman who'd ever made him feel off balance, the only person whose opinion seemed to matter, the only face that appeared in his thoughts when he was supposed to be working. Sophie looked up at him, and for a moment, they stood close enough that Harrison could see gold flecks in her eyes, could smell the faint scent of lavender from her shampoo. His pulse jumped, heat spreading through his chest, and he took a deliberate step backward. She told him she needed time to think. Harrison gave her 24 hours, knowing she'd have no choice but to agree, hating himself for it, and wanting her answer immediately in equal measure. Sophie spent that night pacing her tiny apartment, fury and helplessness burning through her veins in alternating waves. Harrison Cross had systematically dismantled every option, every escape route, backing her into a corner with the cold precision of a predator. And the worst part, the part that made her want to scream, was that people were depending on her. 300 souls who'd finally found stability, who trusted her to keep them safe. She couldn't let them down. Not for her pride. But she didn't have to make this easy for him. By the time dawn broke over the city, Sophie had a plan. If Harrison wanted a wife, he'd get one. but she'd document everything, every manipulation, every piece of corruption. She'd smile for the cameras while collecting evidence, play the devoted spouse while preparing to expose him the moment the year ended. He thought he'd trapped her. He had no idea she'd just declared war. When Sophie called to accept his terms, Harrison felt relief flood through him with unexpected intensity. He told himself it was just satisfaction at securing what he needed, nothing more. But when she arrived at his office that afternoon to sign the contracts, he found his hands restless, his attention fractured, hyper-aware of every movement she made. Sophie read through every page with meticulous care, asking sharp questions that showed she understood exactly what she was signing. Harrison watched her, admiring despite himself the way her mind worked, the way she fought even in defeat. When she finally signed, her hand steady on the pen, he felt something twist in his chest. Triumph mixed with an emotion he refused to examine. She told him she had conditions. First, separate bedrooms. He agreed easily, ignoring the irrational disappointment that flared. Second, she'd continue running Horizon's house without his interference. He nodded, already planning to have his assistant ensure she had everything she needed. Third, they'd present as a couple in public, but in private, they were strangers with a business arrangement. Harrison agreed to everything, knowing he'd find ways around those boundaries, ways to get closer. He needed to, for the inheritance. At least that's what he told himself. The wedding was efficient and cold, held at City Hall 3 weeks later with only the required witnesses. Sophie wore a simple gray dress and refused to smile for the official photo. Harrison found himself staring at her profile throughout the brief ceremony, his chest tight, his mind cataloging details, the stubborn set of her jaw, the way she held herself apart from him, the pallor of her cheeks. When the officiant pronounced them married, Sophie turned to leave immediately. No kiss to seal the union. Harrison told himself he was relieved. The lie sat heavy on his tongue. Moving Sophie into his penthouse was a study in tension. She arrived with 3 suitcases and a potted plant. Her expression shuddered as she walked, through rooms that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Harrison had prepared the guest suite, the one farthest from his own bedroom, telling himself it was what she wanted, what the contract specified. But watching her unpack, seeing her belongings in his space, made something possessive and primal surge through him. She was here, in his home, his wife. The word sent heat spiraling through his veins. Sophie barely spoke to him that first week. She left early for Horizon's house and returned late, taking meals in her room, treating the penthouse like a hotel. Harrison found himself manufacturing reasons to be in common areas when she was home, working at the dining table instead of his study, making coffee in the kitchen at odd hours, anything for a glimpse of her. He was being ridiculous. He knew it. But he couldn't seem to stop. The first public appearance came 10 days after the wedding, a charity gala where they needed to debut as a couple. Harrison's lawyer had been clear. The inheritance clause required they be seen together regularly, living as genuine spouses. Marcus was already raising questions, already digging for proof that the marriage was a sham. Sophie descended the stairs that evening in a deep blue dress that made Harrison forget how to breathe. She'd left her hair down, soft waves framing her face, and when she met his eyes, he saw grim determination there mixed with something else. Nervousness, maybe, or dread. He offered his arm, his voice rough when he told her she looked beautiful. Sophie ignored the compliment, slipping her hand through his elbow with obvious reluctance. But the moment her fingers touched his sleeve, Harrison felt electricity arc through him, his skin hypersensitive to even that small contact. This was going to be harder than he'd anticipated. At the gala, Sophie played her role flawlessly. She smiled, made small talk, let Harrison keep his hand on the small of her back as they moved through the crowd. But he could feel the tension in her body, the way she flinched microscopically every time he touched her. Each reaction was a small rejection, and Harrison found himself bothered by it far more than he should be. The evening stretched on, an exercise in exquisite torture. Harrison was acutely aware of Sophie beside him, the warmth of her body, the subtle scent of her perfume, the way her laugh sounded false when she spoke to his business associates. He wanted to hear her real laugh, the one he'd heard once from across a conference room 3 years ago, when she didn't know he was listening. Midway through dinner, Marcus approached their table with a predatory smile. Harrison's cousin congratulated them on the marriage with mocking sincerity, his eyes calculating as he looked between them. He commented that it all seemed very sudden, very convenient, given the timing of the will. Sophie's hand found Harrison's under the table, squeezing once, a warning or a show of solidarity. He wasn't sure. But the touch sent his pulse racing, made it difficult to focus on Marcus's veiled threats. Harrison forced himself to respond coolly, pulling Sophie closer with his other arm, playing the devoted husband while his mind struggled to process the feeling of her pressed against his side. After Marcus left, Sophie pulled away immediately, but her eyes were thoughtful. She told Harrison that his cousin was dangerous, that he wouldn't stop looking for proof the marriage was fake. They needed to be more convincing. The irony wasn't lost on Harrison. She was right. They needed to appear more connected, but every moment near her left him feeling more unbalanced. He agreed, his voice carefully neutral, not trusting himself to say more. The ride home was silent, thick with unspoken tension. Harrison found himself studying Sophie's reflection in the car window. The way exhaustion had settled over her features, he wanted to ask if she was okay, if the evening had been too difficult. But the words felt too intimate, too close to caring. He did care, he realized with uncomfortable clarity. Somewhere between trapping her and marrying her, Sophie had become more than a means to an end. The thought should have alarmed him. Instead, it felt like a truth he'd been avoiding for years. At the penthouse, Sophie kicked off her heels in the entryway with a sigh of relief. Harrison watched her pad barefoot across his marble floors, saw her shoulders drop as she shed the evening's pretense. She turned to tell him good night, and for a moment, their eyes met and held. Harrison felt the words rise up unbidden. An apology, maybe, or a confession he wasn't ready to make. But Sophie looked away first, murmuring something polite before disappearing toward her room. He stood alone in the entryway long after she'd gone, his heart pounding against his ribs like he'd run a marathon, and wondered what the hell he'd gotten himself into. The following weeks became an intricate dance of proximity and distance. Harrison found himself drawn to Sophie with increasing intensity, manufacturing excuses to be near her, working from home more often, timing his mornings to coincide with hers, asking her opinion on business matters he didn't actually need help with. Sophie remained polite but distant, clearly counting down the days until their agreement ended. But Harrison noticed the small things, the way she'd started leaving books in the living room, how she'd begun making enough coffee for both of them, the way her guard would slip for brief moments when she forgot to maintain her walls. One evening, Harrison came home to find Sophie frustrated over a phone call. Horizon's house was struggling despite his funding, community resistance was mounting, and Sophie suspected someone was orchestrating the opposition. Harrison knew immediately it was Marcus, trying to undermine their marriage by attacking what Sophie cared about most. Rage flared through him, protective and fierce. Over the following days, Harrison deployed his resources with ruthless efficiency. But he also did something else. He visited Horizon's house himself, wanting to understand what drove Sophie's fierce determination. He arranged for additional services through anonymous donations, unable to stay away. The fourth time he visited, Sophie caught him leaving. Harrison couldn't find his usual smooth lies. He told her the truth, that he'd wanted to see it. to understand what mattered so much to her. Something changed between them in that moment. They started talking more after that. Harrison found himself sharing things he'd never told anyone. About his grandfather, about the loneliness of building an empire with no one to share it with. Sophie listened, occasionally offering pieces of her own story in return. Harrison felt the final locks on his heart breaking open. He was falling for her. Had probably been falling since the first time she'd stood in his lobby and told him exactly what she thought of him. One night at Marcus's dinner party, his cousin made a cutting comment dismissing Sophie's work as naive. Harrison felt rage boil through him and responded with cold fury, defending Sophie's work and making it clear that anyone who disrespected his wife would answer to him. The table fell silent. Sophie stared at him, her expression unreadable, and Harrison realized he'd just revealed far more than he'd intended. At the penthouse that night, Sophie stopped him before he could retreat. She asked what that had been about, why he'd defended her so fiercely. Harrison was tired of lying. He told her the truth, that watching someone disrespect her made him want to do something he'd regret, that the thought of anyone hurting her was intolerable. She asked if this was real for him, if the arrangement had become something else. Harrison admitted that it had never really been just an arrangement, not for him. He'd been drawn to her from the beginning, had thought about her constantly for 3 years before he'd ever trapped her into this marriage. Sophie's face cycled through emotions, but then her expression shuddered. She told him she didn't believe him. This was just another manipulation. The accusation hurt more than Harrison expected. Sophie left him standing alone, and Harrison felt something crack inside his chest. He'd done this. He'd trapped her, manipulated her, given her every reason to see his feelings as just another calculated move. And now, when his emotions were finally genuine, she couldn't trust them. The next morning, Sophie was already gone. Harrison spent the morning pacing, trying to find a strategy, but this wasn't business. Sophie deserved the truth, offered freely, with nothing held back. The idea terrified him more than any boardroom battle ever had. That afternoon, Harrison canceled all his meetings and went to Horizon's house. He found Sophie in her small office and told her he needed to say something. She nodded warily. He started talking. He told her about the first time he'd really seen her, 4 years ago at a city planning meeting. He'd watched her speak with such passion that something in his chest had tightened painfully. After that, he'd found himself engineering situations where their paths would cross. The property disputes weren't random. He'd been buying buildings he knew she wanted, just to have reasons to interact with her. When his grandfather died and the will revealed its requirements, Sophie's face had been his first thought. Not because she was convenient, but because he'd wanted this, wanted a reason to bind her to him. But he'd gone about it in the worst possible way, used her desperation, manipulated her circumstances. He'd been terrified that if he'd approached her honestly, she would have said no. Harrison's voice cracked when he admitted that he was in love with her. Completely, irrevocably, terrifyingly in love. He didn't expect her to feel the same way, but he needed her to know his defense of her hadn't been strategy. It had been a man protecting the person who'd become his entire world. Sophie stared at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Finally, she spoke. She told him that she'd caught him visiting Horizon's house multiple times, learned about the anonymous donations. She'd started wondering if maybe he wasn't the heartless villain she'd convinced herself he was. She'd been fighting her own feelings, terrified of being manipulated, terrified of caring for someone who'd trapped her, but watching him the previous night had cracked something open inside her. She couldn't promise her feelings matched his intensity yet. Trust took time. But if he was patient, they might find something real together, something built on genuine choice. Harrison nodded, relief flooding through him. Sophie stepped closer and cupped his cheek. She told him she was willing to try, but he had to promise complete transparency, no more manipulation. Harrison promised he would wait as long as she needed, would earn her trust day by day. The following months unfolded with new sweetness. Harrison courted Sophie properly, and she slowly lowered her walls. The man she'd married out of desperation was becoming someone she chose to love freely. 3 days before their anniversary, Sophie asked to meet him in his study. Harrison spent the day dreading that she was going to leave, but Sophie told him she'd been reviewing their contract. While it specified a minimum duration, it said nothing about the maximum. She'd fallen in love with him, she said. She didn't want to leave. She wanted to stay, to build a real marriage, to choose him every day for the rest of their lives. Harrison crossed the distance between them, cupping her face with infinite gentleness. He told her that she was his first thought every morning, and his last thought every night. That she'd given his life meaning beyond wealth and power. He wanted forever with her. Sophie smiled, that genuine, transformative smile that made Harrison's heart race. She told him that sounded perfect. On their actual anniversary, Harrison woke to find Sophie beside him, morning light painting her face in soft gold. When she stirred awake, she asked if he had any regrets. Harrison told her the truth. He regretted the manipulation and pain he'd caused. But he couldn't regret that his desperate scheme had somehow led them here. Sophie reached for his hand. She admitted that she used to dream about exposing him, but those dreams had transformed into futures they'd build together. As they lay there in the morning quiet, Harrison reflected on how completely his life had changed. He'd inherited billions, but none of it compared to the woman in his arms. Harrison pressed a kiss to Sophie's forehead and whispered that he loved her. Sophie echoed the words back, her eyes shining with emotion. They had started with a contract and a trap, but they'd built something real, a partnership based on choice, a love that had grown despite every reason it shouldn't. And that made him the richest man alive.